Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It's the week of December 2nd, and this is your Monday briefing. Congress returns this week for the remaining 3 weeks of its lame duck session, and funding the federal government before the current temporary funding bill expires on December 20th will be its top priority.
Last week, the proposed regulations on the taxation of previously taxed earnings and profits, or PTEP, were issued, and we're going to have more details in an upcoming episode. But first, Scott, I want to talk to you about this lame duck session. One of the big issues is government funding.
Yes.
Could you talk about what is going to be required at this point as we're heading into this to make that happen?
Sure, this is a classic example of simple but not easy. It's pretty simple. You either turn the switch on and fund the government and prevent a government shutdown from occurring at midnight on December 20th, or you don't, and you actually do get some kind of deal done. So there are a couple of moving parts here before they get it done. One is the length of the short-term extension. We're not talking about a fulsome budget here. Congress will not exercise that particular prerogative. Rather, they will do another short-term extension. Will it go to the end of March? That seems the most likely outcome, but that's one of the things that they have to agree on. And it's an odd situation where you have the currently constituted Congress that will not be the same as the Congress we get in early January when Republicans take over the Senate. So there's a little bit of a party dynamic as well. Both parties angling for some kind of advantage that will either get something now that they might not otherwise be able to get next year, or that will tee up a conversation for next year. For instance, can they come together on this deal and make it amicable, so we just get a government funding bill with no shutdown, and still keep the lines of communication open so that they might be able to do yet another bipartisan deal before the end of March, which is not necessary. It's possible that with Republicans controlling both the House and the Senate, we will get a strictly partisan deal next year.
Right.
But it's also possible that you might see Democrats and Republicans come together to work on the budget and or the debt ceiling issue, which comes back on January 1st. So there are a lot of moving parts here. Like I said, not entirely difficult. They either pass it or they don't. But getting there is incredibly complicated.
Right. I feel like that doesn't change year to year. The complication is still there.
That's right.
So let's turn to something that we're all in the tax world, we're focused on, which is tax legislation. So talk about the chances of that happening during the lame duck session.
Sure. It's a great question because we have a moving vehicle in the form of this legislative package to fund the government that we expect will eventually happen. The question arises, what else could be attached to it? And that's a fairly common question. And it is a non-zero chance. There is at least a possibility that taxes could get added to this. It's not zero, and therefore we have to mention it, but the chances are pretty slim. They seem to be looking at beyond just funding the government, maybe some disaster relief because of the hurricane damage that had happened in various parts of the country. And they're even talking about possibly the Taiwan deal. There was some tax provisions that would essentially replicate a tax treaty in terms of our relationship with Taiwan, preventing double taxation and some other issues like that. It's conceivable that that could be pulled out from what was a tax bill earlier this year. That piece might move with this. I doubt it, but that's at least come up as yet another possibility. But in terms of the broader tax issues, whether that's the research expense, interest deduction limitation, bonus depreciation, those trio of issues that traveled together earlier this year in a package that ultimately failed, or any other tax issues, that seems unlikely. It's not zero, so we have to pay attention, but it seems unlikely.
And with the slim chance of tax happening in the lame duck session and gets pushed over into 2025, it really does change the nature, right? Because we have a new administration coming in and the moving parts are different. So let me turn to the new administration. So before an administration coming in, we're focused very much on the first 100 days. So what is the likelihood of enacting major tax initiatives during that time?
Sure. Full enactment seems extremely unlikely during that 100 days, but movement of some kind of bill in the first 100 days, at least possible. And we're hearing that from the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. Jason Smith has now, on a couple of occasions, said that he would like to get a bill, if not all the way through the committee, maybe even all the way through the House floor in the first 100 days. Again, extremely ambitious. Maybe not even likely, but it's something that he's putting out there. And I really think we need to reflect on what he's doing here in terms of putting out that ambitious marker. It's not something that can be dismissed very easily. We're in this interesting environment where, because of the election itself and those results, as well as what it has meant for President-elect Trump's nominees, I think the word that would summarize a lot of this is disruption. So it's possible that not only will we see disruption in terms of personnel, but maybe disruption in terms of process as well. And maybe it is possible to get something on a much faster faster timeline than we've typically seen or would typically anticipate. It will probably revolve a little bit around that budget deal that I was talking about, where in 2025 they will have to revisit that, because it seems likely that this will be a Republican-only discussion on the tax bill, because they will use reconciliation, and reconciliation is predicated upon some very important budget considerations. They need to determine the size and scope of what they are willing to spend, what they're willing to deficit finance, and where they need to raise taxes in the form of offsets.
Right.
That conversation will have to be going on at least simultaneously, if not as a precursor to the tax bill. So those are a lot of moving parts, and therefore make the 100 days difficult.
Yes.
But again, he's pushing it out there, and I think it's worth taking seriously and not dismissing.
Okay. And finally, let's turn to tariffs.
Sure.
We had an episode last week with Chris Desmond about the implications. And since then, we've had the announcement of, what's happening with Canada and Mexico. Sure. And if you could, what might actually happen with that position?
Yeah, the tariff question is a very interesting one. We've had some conversations with Republican members of Congress about this. They have been very specific that the purpose of tariffs is leverage. It's a negotiating tool, or at least they anticipate that President Trump will use it as a negotiating tool, and therefore there are certain asks that will go along with it. We understand from news reports that President Trump has already had a conversation with the President of Mexico, for instance, and that she has agreed, or at least he has reportedly said that she has agreed to make some changes in certain immigration-related directions that might be welcomed by the new incoming administration. So that raises the question of, will he actually use the tariffs, or has he gotten what he wanted? Or will he say, well, you've promised this, and so long as you follow through on that promise, I will hold off on tariffs, and then implement them later if I don't get what you had promised or what I think you had promised. So it creates this very interesting dynamic, because the executive, whether that's President Trump or any other president, has enormous leverage in the tariff space to turn these on almost at the flip of a switch. Typically, you require a little bit more grounding with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office doing some research into what exactly is the problem that needs to be solved. But the president also has some authority to use emergency tariffs and initiate them immediately. So to me, it's really a dance here as to what exactly is the ask that President Trump wants, whether that's from China, from Mexico, European Union, Canada, or whatever else. And can that other country deliver at least partially on some of those promises in a way that might delay or defer the tariff decision? Or will President Trump just go forward with the tariffs because he can really just flip a switch and turn them on the drop of a hat the day after inauguration if he wanted to? So it's a moving target right now, but I thought it was interesting, again, to go back to what we heard from the Republican lawmakers, that they think this is a leverage tool, and therefore I don't see it as permanent. Whatever tariffs come in, they may not come off completely, but maybe they come down in terms of their severity over time. So it depends a little bit on the international relations aspect of this, and not just the U.S. domestic outlook. So
there's one other thing that I want to follow up on. You said, it's as simple as flipping a switch. So are companies preparing for that possibility? And I imagine it's very different than if you knew that it was 2 months out versus it could be overnight.
That's right. It's a great question, and I highly recommend that our viewers go back to that conversation with Chris Desmond, because he's a master of these issues and has really been on top of the supply chain challenges. And yes, both from his conversations as well as the ones we've been having, yes, clients are very focused on this. And if they have not already done modeling, they are doing modeling to try to anticipate what their supply chains might look like. They're also trying to think of it in terms of the relationship to tax policy. President Trump mentioned on the campaign that he might like to see or propose a 15% rate for some kind of domestic production activity, as yet ill-defined, but that might come later. But that seems to be part of a two-sided coin. On the one hand, there would be the carrot, the incentive of a lower rate for some kind of domestic activity. On the other side of the coin would be the stick, or some kind of tariff to penalize foreign activity. And if those two work in conjunction, it's possible they might change some behavior. So some clients are thinking about that. What would it look like to consider onshoring some of their production lines is part of the conversation that they're having, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I imagine, as with everything else, the moving pieces, the lift.
That's right.
Like, you've got to move very quickly.
That's right.
So, all right, thank you for that.
Thank you. And for our viewers, in this email, look for links to register for 3 upcoming tax readiness webcasts.
Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us, and we hope you have a great week. Take care.